Okay, so the plan for today is we'll first have one paper presentation, and then I'll pick up on the privacy discussion that I was doing during the last lecture. So, yeah.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Zishan. The paper I'm going to present today is MuleWrite, securing embedded system with return address integrity. The problem the paper wants to solve is the vulnerability of microcontroller-based systems, MCUS. Today, MCUS are very important in the industry because first, they are used everywhere. Second, the vulnerabilities not only harm the MCUS, but also destroy the larger systems. For example, attackers can exploit the vulnerabilities of a Wi-Fi SoC to hijack a smartphone. While important, but MCUS are also fragile. There are two major reasons. First, they have limited resources. Second, they have either simple OS or no OS at all, which means complicated protections like those on desktop systems are unavailable on MCUS. On the other hand, attacks are very effective. Control flow hijacking attacks targeting forward edges and backward edges are a huge threat. Unfortunately, current defenses are either susceptible to the second type attacks or require special hardware extensions. So let's look at the attacks and the existing defenses in more detail. There are two kinds of control flow hijacking attacks. The first one targets the function pointers, virtual table pointers, and the second one targets return addresses. The second one is also called return-oriented programming, ROP. For defenses, first we have control flow integrity. This method is designed for type 1 attacks and cannot handle the second type very well. Second, information hiding. This method is kind of ineffective because the memory size of MCUS is too small, which means the randomization makes little difference. The third one is software fault isolation, SFI. SFI is like a sandbox. Obviously, this method results in high overhead. Fourth, shadow stack. Shadow stack basically is maintaining a separate stack for return addresses. However, this one either requires special hardware or has high overhead. So none of these existing methods can handle the ROP style attacks well enough. However, MuleWrite can prevent ROP style attacks fundamentally. Okay. The core idea behind MuleWrite is one sentence: enforcing return address integrity with maximum compatibility and minimum overhead. The return address integrity means that we're going to make return address never writable. And maximum compatibility means this method does not require special hardware, only an MPU and a general purpose register are enough. And we will see how this method achieves minimum overhead soon. So the key question becomes how to make return addresses never writable. The answer is two words: direct jumps. So how can direct jumps make return addresses unwritable? To answer this question, we should first think about why return addresses are writable. because they are stored in the core stack with local variables and function parameters. When a function needs to return, it goes to the register, and the register goes to the corresponding memory location to find the return address. If this part is writable, and if the attacker overrides this part, the function will jump to somewhere else. So let's replace all indirect jumps with direct jumps. This is kind of hard code. Let's look at the func3 here. It's not like 3. Both func1 and func2 can call func3. So at the end of func3, it has two direct jumps. Now the question becomes how to determine which one is the correct target during runtime. Okay. To solve this problem, we need to know function calls are like a chain. A equals B, B equals C. If we store the chain value somewhere, and we can know the correct return address by checking the current chain value. The chain is encoded using XOR operations. Each time a function needs to call another one, it XOR the current chain value with a hard-coded key here. And so they have different keys here and here. So when function 1 call function 2 from different locations, and so when we enter function 2 from different locations, it has different chain values. The chain values are also the possible chain values for a function is also the FID, function IDs for a function. So we can see here, function 2 has two valid possible FIDs, either C XOR key 1 or C XOR key 1 2. Okay, so by getting the chain, we can get the current FID. Each FID corresponds to return address. When function needs to return, it looks up this table, or function lookup table, and tells function2 which is the correct return address. So when func2 returns to func1, another XOR operation with the same key is applied, so the chain can restore to the previous state. One special case which need to be considered is recursive functions. We can say here, func2 can also call itself recursive. The state register, which holds a chain value, not only holds the chain, but also holds a counter for recursive function calls. For example, function 2 is calling itself. So the counter increases by 1, and when it needs to return, it checks the counter value. If it is greater than 0, if it is greater than 0, it means this function now is inside or it's called by itself. Otherwise, it goes to the FLT. So if we understand this diagram, we kind of already know the major point of Mirai, but we still have some details to cover and some more problems to address. Previously, we have mentioned the FLT, the table. That is a conception table here. So how do we implement this in the real code? it is done by the target lookup routine policy. To make it efficient, it directly uses the value of the FID as a distance from a relative jump. For example, here, func3 has two possible values, 1 or 3. So it put this direct jump under the relative jump by 1 line and 3 lines respectively. So we go here to check this value, either 1 or 3. So we jump to here or here to get the correct original address. Another issue is path explosion. As we can see here, func3 have two possible return addresses, one in func1 and another in func2. But however, it has 4 FIDs. Why? Because both func1 and func3 has func1 and func2 has 2 values. So this causes a problem. The path explosion problem results in unnecessary FIDs and slows down the application. To solve this problem, MuRai splits the state register into multiple segmentations. They are used alternatively, so it can eliminate some unnecessary FIDs. Similarly, the recursive counter can also be segmented. Another important thing to notice is exception handler. It is noteworthy because first, it can happen anytime during the execution. Like a user can press the button at any time. Second, the exception handler code is executed in the privileged mode, so it's more dangerous. The attackers can target them to corrupt the whole system. The solution is that when entering the exception handler, MuRai saves the current state register to a safe region and resets the state register to an initial value. So the function caused by the exception handler are just like other normal functions calls. During the exception handling, SFI is enforced, so the safe region is secured. It is much more efficient compared to protect the whole application by SFI. Here we only secure the exception handling part by SFI. So when we leave the exception handler code region, MuRai restore the saved state register and exit. To evaluate the MuRai, they did several experiments on some representative MCUS applications. Results show that MuRai can make ROP-style attacks impossible because of its features. And MuRai is also better than the current tool, which is backward edge CFI. Because CFI only weakens the attacker's ability to divert the control flow, but MuRai can fundamentally prevent this kind of attack. In terms of runtime and memory overhead, MuRai is also excellent, as shown in these diagrams. The green bar is for MuRai, and compared to nothing baseline, the overhead can be negligible. So in conclusion, MIRA is a security mechanism able to prevent control flow hijacking attacks targeting backward edges by enforcing the return address integrity property on MCUS. So that's all. Any questions?
So, yeah, go ahead. Do they talk about any limitations?
Limitations.
Yeah, especially they have used the stack the CFI mechanism to complement protecting the forward edge, but that has its own vulnerabilities as well.
No, but I was thinking that would it continue to work if I were to make a call to a function, an indirect call to a function, like I compute an address and then call that function? Because then you don't know the return address, where all the return addresses could be, right? I mean,
it only addresses direct addresses. It only addresses direct addresses.
No, it does support indirect calls.
It supports indirect calls.
It does support indirect calls, yeah. Dimensionally it supports.
Any other comments? So I think one thing this paper brings out is that those software control flow hijacking attacks are pretty hard to protect against in an MCU just because the usual things are not there. So these class of techniques are what pretty much you are left with. You didn't mention MPU as to what it is. So MPU are special, it's kind of hardware which ARM processors have in particular, where you can protect regions of the memory. So they are not like full-blown memory management unit, kind of lightweight hardware structures, which these kind of methods are beginning to use. But how are they using the MPU? That you didn't describe. Like, I mean, you mentioned earlier on that it needs the MPU, but where is the MPU being used in the method?
It's used in the safe region, which means exception handling.
Oh, in the exception. Great. Well, thanks. So. Okay, so we are going to pick up on the privacy discussion we were having last time. So if you recall, sort of I had described that one way of thinking about this whole sort of privacy problem, well, there are several different ways, but there's one specific one which is privacy of inferences. So you are sharing data with some entity and you want to make sure that some inferences which could be drawn from the data cannot be done by the recipient. And I kind of formulated that problem as one that you can say, look there, I have some data and I want to share, and there is a set of functions I want the recipient to be able to compute, but then there is also a set of functions that I don't want the recipient to know. So like, for example, maybe the recipient should know how many steps I took, but shouldn't know that I went to a specific place, for example. And then I described kind of various ways one could go around doing it, but kind of the basic idea being that there is some sort of processing I need to do on the data prior to it being shared. And so conceptually kind of I had introduced this notion of a firewall of sorts, except that this firewall is really acting in terms of inferences which are allowed or not. So we are going to do some perturbation, for example, on the data before handing it out. So one way you can think about is that I could compute precisely what the recipient needs and then just hand that over. The challenge which comes there is the following, that things that the recipient wants to be computed. So I had this figure last time. So I have some raw data, I'm going to process it somehow, and then I'm going to get this new data M, and this is the data that I'm going to send to the recipient. And my goal is that there is some function f of f of b, let's call that x. I want the recipient to know that very well. Okay, so that's my kind of the that's needed to for the service that I need from the recipient. So I do want to make sure that if I'm sending M to this entity, then it's still able to compute the same X very reliably. So in some senses, the uncertainty about X that exists given this m that we are receiving is 0, that we are not perturbing, we are not introducing additional uncertainty about the noise effects. So there should exist some computational method using which from m x could be computed. And of course one of the ways is that I just make m equal to x, right? I mean, if I make m equal to x, then of course, trivially speaking, this can be taken to x. But I have the additional constraint that there is some function y, some random variable y, which is a function g of d, and what I want to make sure is that this entity, the recipient, is unable to get y very reliably. So if it were to estimate y using m, then it should have a high degree of uncertainty. And or alternatively, you can say that the mutual information between m and y is close to 0. That is, m doesn't carry any information about y. Now, this is where, as you can see, that the strategy that I compute x, that is, I make m equal to x and send it out, that may not work, because it's possible that x and y are highly correlated, have a lot of mutual information, right? I mean, trivially speaking, if y, let's say if y equal to 2x, let's say, then of course, if I compute x, then I'm computing y. So in general, my black list of functions and the white list of functions, they are not orthogonal, right? I mean, the things that I do need for the service may leak information about things that I'm trying to hide. And that's kind of the challenge that generally exists, that the world is pretty complicated. Almost every, I made this point earlier, almost any sensor reveals data about any inference, and inferences are correlated, generally speaking. Very, very hard to not do things. I was interviewing someone for a postdoc position in my group, and we gave kind of his work has a pretty cute example, which I will probably hand out as a paper for next week. So what this guy does is, in cars, nowadays there is this notion of usage-based insurance. And so essentially they kind of grab data from the OBD2 port in your car and all. And the thing is, there is obviously a lot of concerns about privacy and all of them. So one of the things that insurance companies do worry about is how much you are braking, right? I mean, if you are driving smoothly versus you're braking a lot. So so braking events are used by them, and you might say, if all the insurance company is collecting is braking events every time I brake, so basically the car gives out the intensity of the braking, right? So imagine braking intensity versus a time, so that plot, okay? And that's being shared, and you may say, okay, what can I leak with that? Well, this work, which is in an upcoming conference, shows that they can figure out the location. Now, the way they kind of do it is the following, that it's kind of, it's an insurance company, you are a subscriber, so they know where you live, you have your home address. And from that point on, and then given that there is information from Caltrans and these kind of entities about the traffic flow, and it turns out that when you brake, how you brake under 4 circumstances: stop and go, left turn, right turn. They have very unique profiles. So they basically fit it into a map together with the traffic information, and then basically begin to get the location, and they show pretty good accuracy. So another one which he talked about, apparently from his group, in electric vehicles, using the battery level, they get the location, very similar to something that I had mentioned earlier in context of phones, some work out of Stanford, where battery levels in the phone, together with map information about cellular base stations, could be used to get the location. So I think we have seen it sufficiently in this course that all these things are correlated, and that's what makes this problem so hard. That it's not very easy to come up with a policy to transform this B into M in a manner which simultaneously achieves these two goals. Generally, it's impossible. So that's what leads to this privacy utility trade-off, that you want to say, okay, I'm going to be happy, I have to iterate the service quality somewhat so that I can achieve some privacy goal. But even then, it remains kind of a incredibly hard kind of a problem. So unless you happen to be lucky that X and Y are kind of just totally orthogonal, and one doesn't carry any information about the other, in general, you have a pretty hard problem at hand. Then furthermore, there are usually, going back out here, there are additional constraints on how you do this obfuscation or transformation of B into this M that you're sharing. So you also want to make sure that in many settings that the recipient doesn't know that you perturb the data, because oftentimes if it knows that you perturb the data in this a particular place, then that's a giveaway. So like for example, if I simply were to censor whenever I was doing the sensitive thing, whenever y was true, I were to censor it out, then of course you can just reverse infer that wherever censoring happened, y must have been true, and that's a giveaway. So then also plausibility matters, right? In some settings, what you also want to make sure is that the recipient doesn't even know that I'm attempting to hide something, because just attempts to hide are a giveaway. So for example, if I'm sharing some sort of a perturbed thing, so a very common strategy is that we replace the original data or time series or whatnot by kind of a fake one. Well, we do want to make sure that the fake one is plausible, right? For example, if the recipient knows that I smoke, let's say, but then the time series is not showing any smoking event, then that's the giveaway. So it should still match kind of the priors. So you could imagine all sort of constraints that exist. So there is kind of a game going on that we are trying to deceive the recipient into thinking why didn't take place, and yet the whole thing is still kind of genuine data, right? I mean, that's what you want to achieve. And incredibly hard problem, lots of people try. I would basically say kind of no theoretically satisfying answers there. Some of the things, so some time ago, one work that happened in my group was a project called IP Shield, and where basically what we attempted to do was the following, that we went after this notion that lots of applications subscribe to sensors, and and nowadays I think this is 4 years, 5 years old word. Nowadays, of course, Android and iOS have become much more dynamic and all, but there used to be a time where only at the time of installing the app would they ask you for the permission, and then you'll give the permission and move on. The problem is it's very hard for you to reason about when you give permission to access certain type of data, let's say accelerometer or battery level or whatnot. What are you giving away? So one of the things that IP Shield would do is that it would track what sensors different apps are trying to access, and then based upon the literature and all, it would basically tell the user what inferences could be made from that data that the application is collecting. So like an application would ask for accelerometer and battery level. Well, it would kind of say, using this, these are the inferences that you are at risk of. So the idea being that if you let the user have some visibility into what risk they are taking, what all can be inferred when you are giving access to an application to a particular data, then they can exercise some control. And then another thing you can do was that you could specify different ways of perturbing the data. So like add noise or things like that, so that you can attempt to fool the things. So anyway, and there are other pieces of work by other groups in a similar manner. So basic issue then is the following, that we, if you think of the overall landscape, so what happens is there are several parties in this, right? There is the entity being sensed. So let's say us. Then there are the sensors which are sensing us. Now there are many different settings. In some cases, the sensors which are sensing you belong to you. So like I'm wearing the watch, it's under my control. So I'm the party being sensed, but I'm also the party who owns the sensor. But that's not necessarily always the case. For example, my phone, let's say if it is collecting microphone data, then if you speak something, it may pick that up also, right? So in that case, you are the sensed party, but I'm the owner of the sensor. And then, I guess depending upon the law of the land, the ownership kind of is vague, right? I mean, usually ownership of the data resides with the person whose sensor it is, but there are legal constraints on what am I allowed to do or not. So like for example, here in California, I can't record you in a setting where you would have a reasonable expectation of being private, but that only applies to acoustic data. It does not apply to, for example, let's say if I were to put some sort of other sensors, LiDARs or accelerometers and whatnot, and collect the data, California law is silent on that. So, so the relationship between individuals and kind of the sensors and the owners is kind of a tricky one. But and then there are the subsequent users. These could be, let's say, researchers who are collecting the data. These could be UCLA facilities, various kind of service entities. But one notion which emerges from the discussion I have is the following: that this entity, the one who's collecting the data, either because of the force of law, or because it's being nice, or because it is data owner is the same as the individual, when they share the data, they are going to sort of transform the data. Sometimes people call it perturbation or masking or transformation, but kind of the idea is that you don't simply give the raw data, but you at some stage are going to mask the data. Okay. Now there are two. Even here, there are there's another party here which I have not sort of listed. Oftentimes, what happens is that the sensors send the data to some sort of aggregator. So there is some sort of a broker or a collector or an aggregator which collects the data, and that and then kind of the final consumer gets the data from that aggregator. And one of the questions which comes up is, do you trust that aggregator, like someone who's collecting that data? So where does this masking happen? Whether it happens before I send to the collector, before the sensor sends to the collector, or whether the collector does this perturbation, depends upon what the trust relationship is between the collector and the sensor. So as you can imagine, it's kind of a complicated milieu of things. Then the nature of data matters a lot, right? I mean, sometimes this data is simply kind of some sort of a record, maybe my name and address and stuff like that. But in our context, what we're often worried about is that this data are longitudinal time series, okay, collected potentially for long durations of time. So again, a material difference between you taking a short snippet of someone's data versus collecting that data over days or months or weeks, right? I mean, there's a lot more to be learned from the latter. So traditional, so there are many different approaches to this whole game of perturbation in an attempt to exercise control over what can be inferred or not inferred. So kind of the idea is that I have original data and I'm subjecting it to this transformation process in an attempt, and so now what I get is the same data, but which has been sanitized in some shape and form. So if you think that, let's say this is traditional data like the records in a database and all, so what I might do is I might suppress some of the fields in that record. So think of each entity or a bunch of records corresponding to me. So I can suppress attributes, I can encode them, I can perturb them, as in add noise. There's a concept of generalization. So the idea behind generalization is, let's say, instead of reporting the value of an attribute, I cluster attributes into sets, and then I report the set. So like, for example, instead of saying my age is whatever, let's say 33, I would say my age is between 30 and 35. So I kind of generalize it. Encoding may mean, for example, I assign random IDs. So for example, instead of giving the true names, in a medical study, let's say, I can assign random identifiers to the people and then use that for example. So I kind of take away semantics from it. So I still retain the fact that they were distinct, but there are no meaning attached to it. Or likewise, instead of giving the actual city, I might say city A, city B, city C, okay? So those are kind of common things. Suppression means basically I delete that entire attribute from the record. Now the problem is the following. So the idea behind this thing was pretty reasonable, that we are going through measures like these, we are going to make it harder or impossible to make inferences. So like, for example, should not be able to de-identify an individual, or should not be able to associate a particular attribute with a particular individual, right? So you should not be able to figure out that, whatever, I watched a particular movie, let's say, you don't want to be able to figure that out, those kind of things. So the attacks here are the so-called re-identification and disclosure attacks. So let's say this a database, let's say a database of whatever, Amazon's database of what books you purchase, or Netflix's database of what movies you watched, or something like that. And they have anonymized it, or whatever, they have done all this sanitization using these kind of methods. But then as an attacker, your goal is, can I re-identify an individual in this new database, or and associate properties with that record. So that's the input perturbation, that we sanitize the data. We have a sanitized database. We release that sanitized database and hope that we are able to achieve our privacy properties. The other approach is output perturbation, and the idea out here is that I will have the original data. So there are a couple of ways you can imagine. So let's say this original data set is sitting with this collector, and let's say, for the sake of argument here, that the individuals trust that collector. Okay, so collector is some party which you trust for whatever reason. And now in this setting, what happens is that there is a querier, some entity which needs to query this data. Okay. So let's say you might want to ask how many individuals in this city have salaries above 100K, stuff like that, those kind of questions. Okay, typical database queries. And what we want to make sure is that it gets an answer which is of reasonable quality, yet maintaining privacy of individuals. And again, we cannot define privacy in terms of you should not be able to say something about a specific individual in this data set. So in this case, what happens is that collector who has the data, who is answering these queries, it is going to perturb the answers to the queries. So our database is pristine, and because we trust the collector, but the queries that are being coming to us, when we answer them, we add noise to them or do some other perturbation. So in this case, we are perturbing the output. There are a variety of ways this could be structured. So one is, this is how kind of I described, but other ways could also be, like, for example, I can take this data set and then maybe replace the whole data set by a synthetic data set which can continue to answer those queries very well. Okay, so that's another approach. So what has emerged in around, I think 2006 was the very first paper, this concept of differential privacy. So it came out of a researcher at Microsoft. Someday, I think she's going to get Turing Award. I mean, this is considered to be kind of a real major theoretical breakthrough. But the basic idea is that how could I systematically add noise to the queries that I am answering so as to provide a guaranteed notion of privacy, and we'll see what that notion is and all. So kind of a rigorous guarantee. To jump ahead, basically what differential privacy makes as a guarantee is the following, that the adversary, the querier, by querying, will not be able to infer whether any individual is in this data set or not. Okay, that's and the reason kind of this differential privacy came into being was that the approaches which were based on these preceding kind of things, where you kind of sanitize the data, failed miserably. So there was a very famous attack out of a PhD, as part of a PhD thesis at MIT, which kind of broke into private data for the governor of Massachusetts, private health data and all, and showed that what the weaknesses of those kind of approaches were. Okay, so input perturbation, as I mentioned, kind of the idea is that we start with the pristine data set, but prior to publishing this data and then doing, and on top of it you do the analysis, you kind of systematically go around removing things. So like in this case, what happened? So I had this record of patients, what their ages were, what the income and disease were. So firstly, there is this concept of PIIs, or personally identifiable identifiers, okay? Essentially things like name. So you kind of delete those. So if you see out here, name is gone. There is, for health type data and all, there's a federal law in this country called HIPAA, which specifies a set of attributes which are not allowed to be deleted. So like when, let's say when UCLA or a hospital system collects the data and all, the PIIs are specifically designated that they cannot be transmitted without appropriate authorizations and all. So that's first thing you see, right? That thing is gone. Then the idea is that you begin to mask information out here. So this is where different ways could happen. I can delete things. I can basically replace some values by not available, or I can do all those games, add some noise to them, so like perturb things, or I could cluster them into ranges, all those kind of things which could be done. And the balance you are trying to strike out here is that if you were to release things as they are, maybe there is a risk of disclosing some private information. So let's say, for example, UCLA were to maintain something like this, but then there are always, even in a city of like LA, there are individuals with pretty unique characteristics. So even if you hide the name, let's say there was someone whose age said 100. Okay, I mean, even in a city like this, how many individuals are there of age 100? Hardly any, right? I mean, so outliers become a problem. So that's the disclosure risk. So which is why kind of you do need to do other perturbations, like give a band of age and stuff like that. But that comes with therefore information loss. You have to be willing that the information you are going to be sharing has to be degraded sufficiently so that those disclosure risk is minimized. Okay, so anonymizing data, so removing identifying attributes, I kind of already mentioned that. So this is this concept of PIIs, and PIIs include name, social security number, phone number, email, anything which is uniquely linked back to a specific individual. The problem is that while these things are defined in laws and the regulations that the government has created, these are really kind of legal entities, okay? So one of the things laws required is that if PII type things are accidentally disclosed, then the consumer must be notified. In fact, at UCLA, I don't know if you have ever received this thing, but I keep getting these reminders that if I maintain any personally identifiable information about students or I guess other parts of UCLA, even like medical school, consumers and all as well, then those computers need special treatment. In fact, for students, there is a law called FERPA law, Federal Education, blah, 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 something like that. So anything which can identify personal information about you, I have to treat very carefully. Even things like, let's say, if I'm discussing your grade, then I shouldn't use, let's say, my personal Gmail address, or I shouldn't host it on my computer, which is not under UCLA control. Now, usually what happens though is that students write to me saying, what's my grade, and they're writing to me from non-UCLA account, so then I guess at that point there is an escape clause there. So, and it's for the very same reason, for example, when I ask for some of the forms and all, I ask only for like the final few digits of your student ID number and all, and yet I notice some of you liberally put your entire ID number in the title page of the presentations you are making. Actually, it's PII information. You should not put it on cover page when you are presenting to the whole class. You're giving away personal information. Okay, so PIIs need to be treated carefully, but often are not. Now, the challenge out here is that it's very hard to comprehensively define what are PIIs. Okay, you might, I mean, these are obviously kind of the obvious ones, but there's so many other things which actually become personally identifiable, and if you're not careful about them and if they get leaked, then the de-anonymization becomes super easy. So this is where this attack that I mentioned might be many years ago. So basically what happened was that the Massachusetts Group Insurance Commission, so you know Massachusetts has started out on this precursor to Obamacare called Omnicare, which is kind of an insurance program and all. So the thing is, as part of it, they were releasing all sort of data, and in particular, they were releasing anonymized data on state employees' hospital visits. Okay, whenever, because the idea was that that's a state-funded benefit, and that public has a right to know, so they kind of. And the governor then, a guy called William Weld, is kind of assured that this is safe because guess what? They have anonymized it. So, the original data set would have name, SSN, age, zip code, diagnosis. And what these guys did was they said, okay, we are going to remove the PIIs, so we are going to remove name and SSN. We are going to just publish age, zip code, and diagnosis. And you might say, yeah, I mean that's safe potentially. But then this graduate student, who's a professor at, I guess she was at MIT, but I think she's now at Harvard, if I'm not wrong. So what she did was the following: she basically linked this information together with the voting roll, and in the voting roll you had the name, age, and zip code. Okay, and so guess what is happening now? Age alone is probably okay, zip code alone is probably okay, but the combination of the two, so the longer you make the vector, the more unique that vector becomes. And then you can do what is called as a linkage attack, right? I mean, so you take the vector here and the vector here, and then now you have whatever Alice has age, for example, those kind of things begin to happen. So this is what is called as a linkage attack, what is basically happening is that an attribute by itself may sound innocuous, but a collection of attributes becomes basically a personal identifier, right? I mean, if you take sufficient number of my attributes, and there are many different ways this thing has happened. So, you know, for the 2016 election, this company Cambridge Analytica got a lot of infamy and all, and this work by some faculty at Cambridge, and I guess one of them is at Stanford now. So these guys basically, kind of the idea is a few small number of information about how you interact with Facebook is basically sufficient to uniquely identify you. You can hide everything else and all, but that's essentially a unique vector. In fact, for all practical purposes, it's a PII. And then what happens is your interactions at different websites with different consumers, different service providers, if those vectors can be linked, and now you can begin to kind of do a bigger profile. So it was done very effectively on social networks there. But this is basically what is going on, that re-identifying anonymized information by linking things together, okay? Because between two databases exists a vector of sufficient uniqueness, okay, that you can begin to do things. And people have since shown all sort of things like de-identifying, like some years ago, Netflix ran this competition where they wanted to have researchers develop new algorithms for predicting recommendation for movies. So what they did is they took a database of records from actual consumers, except they anonymized it, and then they released this anonymized data set and then ran a competition. But a group at UT Austin basically de-anonymized it. They sort of worked backwards, that in that data they were able to identify specific individuals and of course their queries and stuff like that. So lots and lots of break-ins that happen. So when you read these things that your data is going to be collected only in an anonymized form, be careful, because you don't know anything about. I mean, all they mean is they're stripping away the obvious identifiers, but that's it. Okay, so now having said that, there are so against that. So the simplest anonymization is we remove the personal identifiable stuff. Okay, so that's not sufficient, as we see. Okay, so what can we do now? Well, so that's when a class of techniques emerged, which basically began to say, in addition to removing the PIIs, we are also going to perturb the data. Okay, so one of the earliest one of this nature was something called k-anonymity, and kind of the idea here is that now I have a database, sensitive data has been removed, but the non-sensitive data I am going to do some perturbation out here in an attempt to diffuse the kind of attack that Sweeney mounted on that governor's medical record. So what happens in k-anonymity is yeah, okay. So this is a data set we are publishing, and attacker has this additional knowledge, which is a voter registration list, right? I mean, just like the setting previously. But what we are, and the attack was that kind of a linkage attack. So the problem is the following, that as I said earlier, that even if we are not publishing the identifiers, we are effectively creating de facto identifiers, because those vectors of information begin to act as de facto identifiers, or as they're often referred to as quasi-identifiers. In sensor data, you have a similar issue. Let's say we are collecting sensor data, which let's say of inertial sensors from your wristwatch or phone or stuff like that, right? And we remove information about our name and stuff like that. But still, let's say we went through an exercise where we collected data from accelerometers for the whole class. Well, can we de-identify? So what kind of things do you think? So my assertion is that even simply accelerometer data for the day is sufficiently de-identifying that maybe we cannot de-identify everyone, but fair number of people we can. So what all things do you think from a day-long data set, day-long anonymous inertial data set can you learn? As a timestamp, the usual accelerometer data timestamp, right? Or from midnight to midnight, let's say.
As you mentioned earlier, you can get the location of that person.
Yeah, what else? Can you de-identify me?
Yeah, based on the activity signatures.
Okay, so what kind?
From here to your office.
Okay, what else? I mean,
like the style of walking,
style of walking, maybe someone who limps. Actually, another interesting one is our height relates to the biomechanics. So the way our hands move, as well as our steps, they are both related to our height. So you could do a reasonable extrapolation from that. So those of you who are average height have an advantage. I think I'm probably among the taller ones in this group, so outliers can be deciphered that way. Maybe if you know something about the hours I keep, that can be a giveaway, right? I mean, so all these kind of things can little add up. So this notion of quasi-identifier can even exist if I have a single attribute, namely the accelerometer data is just that I have it longitudinally, right? Okay, so that's almost a given. So attributes can therefore be divided into attributes which are identifying, attributes which are quasi-identifiers that I described, right? That is, even if you didn't have them, if I were to just look at the set of these quasi-identifying attributes, then they are unique, okay, or almost unique, okay? So in database parlance, basically it means we can use them as a key. Okay, that is, they identify a unique record. And then finally, there are attributes that are confidential, right, which we want to keep secret, disease status and such. the challenge often that we face is that these two sets are overlapping quite a bit. Okay, so even though you strip these away, you still need these, and these two are often overlapping. Okay, so like for example, if it's a genetic database, then genetic data, stuff like that, right? Another challenge which you also face is that in certain kind of data, things are correlated. Okay, so if you are able to de-identify one individual, then using that you can de-identify other individuals whose attributes correlate. So a great example is DNA kind of things, right? I mean, there is a relationship that exists between them. So in fact, 2-3 years ago, there was that famous case that was broken where this guy who had murdered a lot of people back in 1980s in Bay Area, he was finally caught because they were able to mount some search on a public genetic database and locate that guy who's a former cop, his relatives, and then from that they can work backwards, right? So correlation across records can also be a giveaway, right? Okay, so we have these different kind of attributes, and what k-anonymity does is, k-anonymity property basically says that if with respect to the quasi-identifier set, right, so the key attributes, the number of records with that value of the quasi-identifier is at least k. So this is basically saying that we are trying to make that quasi-identifying attribute no more unique. Okay, we have to make sure that if there exists a particular value of that vector of attributes, then there are at least k such entries in my data. So so in a sense, we basically insist that it's no longer a key. Let's see how we can potentially do it. So let's say this is our data. So we see age, zip code, sex, and illness, and we kind of our QID in this case is age, zip, and sex, because kind of the idea is that this could potentially occur in, let's say, voter registration data set, for example. So the idea out here is what we want to make sure is that for any possible combination of this tuple, age, zip, and sex, there should be at least any combination that exists, it should exist with at least k of them. Okay, so that if I were to hunt, I can at most narrow it down to k individuals, and hopefully k is sufficiently large so that there is sufficient ambiguity at that point. Okay. Now, of course, k has to be large enough for something which is particularly embarrassing, like I don't know, like someone engages in whatever weird behavior. So you want to make sure that k is sufficiently large, because it's not very comforting that I'm one of 3 people in LA who has that kind of negative connotation. So you do want k sufficiently large. Of course, as you can see, that the way to achieve this thing will have to be that we'll have to perturb things, right? I mean, we'll have to artificially modify age, zip, and sex in order to achieve that, and that therefore our ability to answer queries effectively is going to be suffered. So the idea is that if I were to look at so essentially, this is a SQL statement which basically lets me count every unique combination of sex, zip, and age. And if we find that there are groups which counts less than k, then that means our k-anonymity property is not satisfied. And then I'll have to modify my data. I'll have to perturb this database in order to achieve this. So to achieve k-anonymity, let's say it turns out that I have some combinations which are occurring non-zero but less than k, then generalization, in this case the idea is that I replace specific quasi-identifiers with more general values. So for example, instead of giving the full phone number, I may just use the area code. So that's a form of generalization. I'm clustering the values into groups. Suppression. So in this particular case, if it turns out that some values are way too unique, and generalization would cause a lot of problem. Like for example, if it was age, and like I said, I mean, even in a city like LA, probably the tail of old people, which is kind of very few. So generalization is not going to be very helpful out there. So what you might want to do is just drop them entirely. You say not available for them. So lots and lots of work happen in k-anonymity. If you go to Google Scholar and type k-anonymity, I wouldn't be surprised if you get like 10,000 references or maybe even more. One of the most cited papers in computer science, the one which introduced k-anonymity. In fact, k-anonymity was introduced by the same Sweeney who broke into the governor database. So, so a lot of work on how can I achieve k-anonymity with minimal impact on the quality of the eventual information. Now, the problem that we run into out here is something that is called as curse of dimensionality, which essentially essentially the idea is the following: if I'm going to do this k-anonymization, then for it to be effective, I need to have things nearby, because if I'm going to cluster things which are far away, then it's going to have a huge, bigger impact on the quality of the answers I'm able to give, right? So the record must have sufficient number of or k close neighbors. Now, in small dimensions, that's often true. The problem is that we often deal with data sets which have large number of dimensions, large number of distinct attributes like that, age, name, and stuff like that. So like Netflix data set that I referred to had 17,000 dimensions. Amazon customer records, several million dimensions. And what curse of dimensionality refers to is the fact that relative to, for you to get the same property that they have k close neighbors, as the number of dimensions grows, the number of points you need grows much, much faster than that, okay? So the curse of dimensionality is that the size of data that you need to maintain this k neighbors nearby property, you need a humongous data set, and of course, if you don't have it, right? So large as these data sets are, they still, once you have lots of dimensions, essentially there is an intrinsic sparseness to them that appears. Things like sensor time series and all are even more so in this. So another way of saying is that when you have a large number of dimensions, your nearest neighbors are quite far, okay? And therefore, k anonymity and all, kind of the underlying assumption that there is locality kind of falls apart, and essentially if you k-anonymize these kind of data, you essentially have a huge hit on the accuracy, so that's not terribly effective. So there are other ways you could approach this thing. You can say, okay, fine, even though my data set has so many dimensions, I'm going to project it into a lower dimensional space. Okay, how could you project into a lower dimensional space? What kind of techniques can be used? Huh? Yeah, so PCA, for example, right? Okay, so you could use sort of methods you have probably studied in other courses to project and retain kind of only the important dimensions and all, and hopefully kind of that's where you have things. So people try all these kind of techniques and all, but if you were to just work in that high dimensional space, you're unlikely going to have enough data. So then what happened is, okay, then additionally what happened was that people pretty soon showed that because records have correlations, so k-anonymization usually doesn't work very effectively, and that even if you were to k-anonymize, people showed that you can mount attacks on them. You can decipher, whatever, de-anonymize it. So lots of other methods emerged, L diversity, T closeness. They all basically try to deal with this issue of correlation and stuff like that. And also, I mean, if you have any interest, you can follow up on these papers. I'm going to dive into them, but basically rich body of literature which built upon k-anonymity but basic concepts where they were somehow messing with those attributes. I guess stepping back, one of the challenges with this class of methods have been that they are really kind of focused on the syntax of the data. Okay, they're looking at the values, the distribution, their nearness, and stuff like that. So, so they focus they're really focused on changing the representation of the data and not so much on what can be learned from that anonymized data. So that's one issue. Another one is, as I kind of pointed out, this quasi-identifier is really kind of a fallacy, okay? I mean, essentially, particularly when we are dealing with things like sensory data and all, almost any attribute can be a quasi-identifier, okay? So you can't cleanly define things that, oh, these attributes are quasi-identifier and I have to be careful and apply k-anonymity or such methods, and these others are safe. There is no safe attribute in reality, or whatever. Most attributes are not safe. And finally, as I said, relies on locality, and that is often not the case. So sort of real world data is not very well behaved in terms of applying these things. So so these things generally kind of failed, I mean, or have not been very effective. Another approach, I guess in the same vein, is that I'm going to add noise to the signals, and this has particularly been the case for like sensor data and all, where we'll say, okay, this time series, let me just add some sort of noise to it. And I've talked about this before. Gaussian noise was added to GPS signals. They add noise to location traces, or we'll say, okay, you want my location trace, here it is, but I've added 100-meter noise to it and all. The problem is, all these kind of things in general can be cancelled out with side information, and that's the analog of the linkage attack in case of the type of data we were just talking about. I can average over time, I can make use of map information, whitelist, all these kind of stuff, white pages, stuff like that. And the other thing is, adding noise impacts utility in unknown ways. So let's say, for example, let's say you are sharing location with an app, and let's say the system were to give you the flexibility of adding noise to your location. So now you got to be careful. If it is an Uber driver coming to pick you up, the kind of noise you are going to add is very different than, let's say, if you want Facebook to tag location, right? Things like that. So, so they're very context dependent, and if you're not careful, things will be pretty dicey. I mean, particularly as nowadays we are also headed into where, based on location, your door gets unlocked, your car gets billed for whatever the toll things, and also a lot of things we rely on information being precise, and yet it's also sort of has privacy implications. Still, these methods are used widely, perhaps with a false comfort. And also, I guess for some kind of data, indeed you could do it if you think through it and are very careful, but sort of just one has to be very, very careful in these things. Okay, so I'll give you another example of kind of things that can be done. So one thing that people have worried about in recent 10-15 years quite a bit is that as smart meters of various forms came into being, kind of the concern emerged that utility companies can begin to learn about your behavior. Okay, and I think I made this point earlier also. So what happened is that previously it used to be that someone will come and read your meter, electric meter, water meter every month or 2 months, and they get the aggregate information, right? Really. But then utilities companies said, but if I can, if we can have finer grained data, then we can do other things, like we can help disaggregate energy usage information, give you more insight into what you are doing. Or maybe the water company can detect that you are violating sprinkler laws, for example. You are sprinkling your garden on days that you are not supposed to, for example. Stuff like, and electric utilities had the argument that if they had access to this data, they can better manage the grid. Another thing that happened is usage. They began to offer things like, if you were to lower your consumption when you are given a signal, then you will get a lower price. So this is called demand response, basically, that if the grid is heavily loaded, then the utility company will basically say, lower your consumption, and in return, you would get a lower rate as part of your account there. So those kind of things. So all kind of things, energy consumption, like some grid, helping with the grid state estimation, things like that. So there are valid uses of this finer grained data, but yet also from that data, as I've shown often, that you can make all sort of inferences about activities and all. So all kind of inferences can be made from it. So what can we do? So just to show you how this problem can have multiple different ways of looking at it. So one way we can say the following: maybe there is an intermediary, an aggregator, which we all trust. So every household, neutral party, not under the control of LADWP, for example, and it collects all our smart meter data, and then it provides LADWP those valid functions that it is after, like for example, how much energy is currently being consumed, or how much energy a given user consumed in a given month, stuff like that. So there could be a list of valid information that the electric utility is allowed to get, but then we trust this entity. Okay? But of course, the question that emerges who this entity is. Maybe it is another agency, maybe a government agency, or some party which has reputation in the state, which kind of plays that role, but not very satisfying because we are dependent upon this entity. Now, you had heard one of the project presentation by these guys out here. So there is a concept called secure multi-party computation. So you can say each one of these guys have this private data, and we all want to collectively learn a set of valid functions. So you can think of this whole problem as a secure multi-party computation problem, in which case we don't have a trust, we don't need this intermediary, but we have a kind of a bit horrendous computation problem at hand. But maybe you might imagine that we could do something like this on a neighborhood or a block, and work with that. So that could be some solution. Another one is I can do physical obfuscation. So if you're super paranoid, what you can do is you can go ahead and have a local energy source. So like you can buy a solar panel or a Tesla Powerwall, basically a big battery unit, and then you can have some sort of a intelligent energy router. But kind of the idea is that we want to break down the relationship between what the utility is seeing versus what is actually happening at the household at that moment. So I can basically, this thing is now acting as an obfuscator of sort. Ideally, only long-term activities can be detected, right? I mean, if I disappear for a vacation and all, maybe my power consumption will go low, but instantaneous things like right now I have the oven on and all can be easily suppressed with this kind of approach. So essentially, this battery together with some smart algorithm out here can hide activities at some time scale out here. But long time scale stuff would still be here, so maybe the only solution. What can you do to hide the fact that you are away long-term things like vacation and all? How would you do it? What would you do? Have timers and all, right? I mean, they turned on off appliances at home to give it a live look.
Consume electricity.
Huh? Yeah, but it will consume electricity. So, yeah, but that comes with the territory. Okay, so we could do. So there's cost, because I need equipment, inefficiency, and those kind of issues that kind of come up. Okay, so yeah, I can skip this. But then finally, you can also do algorithmic obfuscation. Kind of the idea being that could I perturb the data at the meters, assuming that the meter I trust. Okay, maybe it's an open source meter or meter coming from independent parties and all. So what this thing does is it basically obfuscates the data in a manner that utility can still figure out the kind of things it needs, but not the kind of thing it suppresses. So it goes back to what I presented earlier, that there is a set of functions over this power consumption, which I want the utility to be able to compute, like how much energy I consumed in the month, or maybe how much power happened in some small time window that they, or like help them compute the grid state, for example, those sort of things. But I generally want to hide my activity and all. So a lot of people have done work on problems of this particular nature, but it's a classic case of privacy utility trade-off, that I have set some functions that I want the utility to be able to compute, but other functions I want to hide from the utility. So how could we achieve this thing? So a lot of different approaches, but just to show how one can be smart potentially about adding the obfuscation. So the idea is the following: that I have a z from the smart meters, okay, a vector of values, and I'm going to add some noise to it. That's the O, that's the obfuscation, and so I have this new value z of obfuscation. And the thing out here is that if you are smart about it, so it turns out in this particular case there were three objectives that have to be met. One is that I need to be able to get energy consumption of a meter over, let's say, a month to get the billing. I should be able to get the aggregate load currently for the whole neighborhood for that collection of smart meters. And then finally, I should be able to compute, I should be able to do this equation which corresponds to getting the grid state estimate so that the grid can be controlled properly. So it turns out that in this particular case, there's a specific mathematical structure to these things, right? I mean, I need a couple of specific functions and I need the solutions to this equation that it suffers. So it turns out that by adding noise such that it lies in the kernel space of this particular matrix, I can achieve all of these three things. Essentially, we add noise in those dimensions. If you think kind of in terms of some sort of a multi-dimensional space, I'm going to add noise in those dimensions which don't contribute to these things, okay? And then achieve the goal. So so it turns out in some cases you can get away and add noise and still have specific functions be computed in a distortion-free manner. So this is an example where kind of the signal that goes out is utterly noisy, and yet those specific functions can be computed reliably. So obfuscation sometimes can be done, but in general, it's there's no kind of a general strategy to it. Okay, so from this discussion, hopefully some things have become sort of obvious, perhaps. So firstly, privacy is not just encryption. So this is not solving the problem of I'm sending some data to you and trying to keep it hidden from someone observing it, right? Encryption solves that problem supremely well, but that's not the case. I am sharing data with you, but our objective here is that you should be able to compute those whitelist things, the X, but you should not be able to compute the blacklist things, should not be able to get Y. And we need to strike that balance. So that's not what encryption does. It is also not simply in computation of encrypted data. We have talked about that, where we are offloading some computation on a third-party service, let's say Amazon or Google, and I'm dealing with the issue that I don't want that server to know the data. I just want the server to compute, and then I should be able to know the answer. So in this case, I have the data and I want the answer computation over it. It does not solve the problem that I want to share with you the specific value. So of course, what I can always do is I can compute that value, the whitelist, and share with you, but as I shown earlier, it doesn't solve the problem fully because whitelist and blacklist are still kind of correlated. So this at best at part of the answer. Secure multi-party computation does begin to get us into this territory, because it's basically saying I have some X, I want you to know f of X, so we are going to compute it, but it still begs the question that when you get to know f of X, you are also learning something about g of X, the blacklist, and I want to strike some balance over it. So again, it is relevant technology, but it doesn't really solve our privacy problem. There is another thing that you will often hear is access control. I I have a set of agents which want to access some resource, let's say some fields in a database. So you would have rules which specify who is allowed to access what. So like for example, in your operating system, you can attach access permissions to specific files. You can say this file is accessible by user X or group of users and things like that. Again, it's related to, but not really kind of the privacy problem, because once the user accesses that particular file, it has access to the whole file. So there's no control being exercised over that process. So our closest problem is in context of what are called as statistical databases. So this is the kind of stuff like, for example, medical researchers or Census Bureau, they kind of collect. They survey a lot of people, they collect data. In the database, there are records, and then this database is either released for researchers, or we want to answer queries from researchers over this database. So, so a statistical database is basically has data, and the idea is we are eventually interested in letting some parties have answers to statistics over that data. The statistics could range from the usual culprits to even things more complicated like an ML model. So it could be, I want to, I've collected, let's say, I mean right now, well, pretty soon the US Census would take place. So they're going to create this data set. And then there are tons and tons of sociology researchers and all who want to compute various kind of machine learning models over it. We want to make sure that they can learn a good model and yet not leak information about individuals. So, so there are two types of approaches out here. There are purely statistical databases. So the idea is that you don't release the underlying data, but you compute the statistics and you release that. Okay. And the other one is that we provide a database which will have entries, and the user can access it. But when they are doing it, we still want to make sure that private information is not being released. So that's the kind of thing that we are interested in. So now what's happening is I have a whole bunch of users which have some private information as well, some normal human beings. And then there are various kind of data collectors, hospitals and Census Bureau and Google and whatnot. And then there are lots of people who want access to that data to do things like they want to know statistics, they want to learn machine learning models and stuff like that. This, presumably, these two parties, person one and hospital, they have some sort of agreement so that the person shared the data with it. So there are a couple of models out here. One is person trusts the hospital fully, and the other is person doesn't trust the hospital fully. But let's stick with the model where the person trusts the hospital, that the hospital will be a good shepherd of the data. And then the doctors and all, when they access this database, we want to make sure that private information remains private, need to know basis, those kind of things happen. So remember the linkage attack stuff and all, quasi-identifier, we have seen it. But bottom line is that those methods kind of failed to work. So another so a common model that emerges out here is the following, that the analyst, the doctor or whatnot, they kind of run some query. So basically ask the database, can you compute this function f over the database for me? So it could be analyze the sensor data and tell me what's the average number of steps this person took every day in the last month, for example, those kind of things. The challenge is, what we want to make sure is that the answer to this query is not releasing private information. Okay, so that's our setting. We want to make sure that this function, when computed over the database and the answer provided, should not release. This function could also be go and learn a linear regression function or a decision tree over this and tell me the model. Then in that case, we would say the model coefficient should not release information about these entities. So that's our setting. So the output perturbation method. So remember, we kind of showed that perturbing this database is not very effective, right? Because try as we might, even though k-anonymity and all, they kind of are all problematic. So our setting now is that when we are going to respond to this thing, we are going to perturb the answer somehow. So instead of providing f of db, which obviously is leaky, I'm going to compute another function, let's call it f private, whose answer is close to f of db but maintains privacy. And we control this privacy through some handle called epsilon, and think of it like a knob which controls how much privacy I kind of want. So there's a privacy utility trade-off. I'm going to mess with this epsilon to give you more privacy at a poorer quality result, or vice versa. So now that's our setting, and essentially we can say the utility for the analyst, the consumer, is how close these two things are. And privacy for me, for a given individual, is that by telling this what is being really revealed by this about this individual, right? So that's the setting that we have. So in particular, individuals, you could say, do not want their there's a kind of a separate setting where the individuals don't trust the server fully. Okay, so they want to take part in this, but they don't want the server to infer some specific things about that. In which case, instead of sending the data as is, trusting this entity, what they do is they add noise prior to sending. So perturb records also. So this is the input perturbation, and this is often called as we'll see just like we have differential privacy where we add error to the output. This one is called local differential privacy, but essentially prior to sending to the aggregator, we perturb the data. But let's stick with the former model. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to jump some slides. Excuse me. Okay, so differential privacy, which as I said has been kind of a big big change in how sort of computer science has begun to think about privacy, at least in this setting. So kind of the idea is that my adversary is sending me queries, and I'm going to answer. And queries come out of some corpus. So let's say some functions. So maybe the query could be learn a model or give me the average or stuff like that. And my data is sitting in this trusted aggregator for now. So so data is pristine, and then for those queries, and I have this special algorithm which basically runs the query over the data, sends back the answer. What this adversary is trying to do is trying to break the privacy. And the goal is that this differentially private algorithm, when it's responding, it responds by perturbing the answer in some manner. So let's see how that is done. I mean, Apple makes a lot of news about how they use it and all. So the promise differential privacy makes is the following: an individual will not be affected adversely or otherwise by allowing his or her data to be used in a study. So kind of the idea being that the promise we are making is that whether I'm conducting a study, whether you give me your data or not, there is no adverse impact on your privacy. That is, the adversary is not going to learn anything about you just because you participated in the study. That's very different from saying adversary cannot learn something embarrassing about you because maybe based upon your gender or race or age, they already have some prior. So we are not saying the adversary doesn't learn anything about you. All we are saying is your choice to take part in the study doesn't matter, and therefore the rational decision should therefore be that you should be safe. You should think yourself safe taking part in this data. So what we want to achieve is that from this system, database, the differentially private system answering the queries, we want the user, the analyst, to learn something useful about a population and yet learn nothing new about the individual. That's really what we are trying to achieve. That the whole population, a population function can be done, but not the individual knowledge about the individual. So, so at a high level, what we want to achieve is that my estimate of that statistics about the population, a model, machine learning model, some statistical function, whatnot, it should be indistinguishable whether a particular user is in the data or not, in the database or not. Remember, the promise we gave was that whether you take part in the study or not should not matter. So you could equivalently say that my answer to statistical queries over the database should be indistinguishable whether you are in the database or not. Right? Because if it was distinguishable, then the adversary can say you are in the database. So so that's what we want. So so this is the effect that we want. So let's imagine that somehow we are able to come up with an algorithm which does the following. I take a database of records and I consider a neighboring database, and which differs only in one record. That is, we remove one record from this, and that's a neighboring database. And then we conduct a query over this database and this database. And let's say let's say our algorithm, our query is probabilistic in nature. Okay, so when I run the query over this database, it's going to give me an output. And if I'm going to run over this database, it's going to give me an output. What we want to achieve is, so this is a key equation in differential privacy. It basically says that the log of the ratio, that probability that my algorithm, which is the query, running over database 1 leads to an output O, over the probability that algorithm running on T2 gives me the output O, is less than epsilon. If you kind of think about it, what this is basic, and remember, this holds true for any arbitrary pair of D1, D2, and for any output O. So in particular, if it holds this way, it also holds the other way. That is, probability A D2 equal to O and probability A D1 equal to O is less than epsilon. So what this translates into is that probability that my query returns the value O on D1 and probability that it returns the value O on a neighboring database, D2, are very close to each other. That's the indistinguishability. And how close they are is that epsilon parameter, epsilon greater than 0. Okay. So this is how differential privacy says that that neighboring databases, so if I remove a record or add a record, it should basically give me results to my query, which is almost indistinguishable to within this epsilon limit. Okay, so that's so this is how we are kind of simulating this concept of one user being present or absent, and which is why I said the guarantee we are giving to the user who we removed. We are basically saying that, look, whether you take part in it or not, it makes no difference, because adversary is going to see this output O for any output O with the same probability. So over the space of several outputs, the distribution is the same, so adversary can't learn anything about you. Now, the challenge out here is that you need to find an algorithm which achieves this thing somehow, right? I mean, so clearly there are lots of queries where I can never achieve this thing, right? For example, I certainly can't allow what is the age of Joe. Okay, I mean, I can't ask a query like that, because that obviously can't be answered in this manner. So generally the idea is that you would be able to find algorithms which have this property, which are able to satisfy this equation only for certain kinds of queries. And in particular, queries which are about population statistics, so like summation, variance, or learner model, these kind of things, not which select specific records, because then it would be hard. So, but the concept of differential privacy is very general. It basically says that I need to, for the query, for the function of interest, I need to find an algorithm which has this property. But not for all queries can such algorithms exist. Very important that we are doing this business of D1, D2, and O for every possible neighboring databases or datasets, and for every possible output. Okay, so not for a specific output, it's for all outputs, truly indistinguishable. So now what is happening is I can rewrite that equation previously. I can write it in this manner. I can say probability that my algorithm running on D1 gives me O is less than equal to e to the power epsilon probability that running on D2 it would have been given O. And the same thing holds true in the reverse direction also. Therefore, the two are very close to each other. So epsilon, excuse me, epsilon controls the degree to which an adversary can distinguish D1 and D2, and therefore loss of privacy. So now let's step back. So let's say the query we are answering is about, I don't know, let's say average salary in this classroom. Okay. So your goal is that the querier should not be able to learn about presence or absence of any one of us in this group, right? Let's say that was the population. So how much noise do you think you'll have to add? What would guide that? So what's your worst case scenario?
Number of participants.
Everybody has the same salary.
Okay. No. No. So let's say n minus 1 people have very low salary, and there is n individual who's a billionaire. Okay, so let's say everyone else makes $100,000, and there's one guy who makes $1 billion, one person who makes $1 billion. How much noise would you add? Right? I mean, so remember, your worst case scenario is whether that billionaire is present in that data set or not, and therefore the amount of noise you are going to add is going to be dictated by that $1 billion salary, right? Which is basically another way of saying a lot of noise, right? So when done over a small group, and when you have these kind of unique outliers, then differential privacy does run into trouble. You have to sacrifice utility a lot to be able to do it. So this degree of privacy that you want, in part, is going to affect on the quality that you have. So one has to be careful, but you could essentially, the amount of noise you have to add kind of has to depend upon how much perturbation in the worst case to the value of a query is made by presence or absence of one member in the data set. So this does allow this protection against inferring membership of a record. You have a very quantifiable notion of privacy loss. It has some nice properties. Like, for example, it composes. What I mean by that is, if you take a differentially private algorithm and then you take another differentially private algorithm on top of it, that composition is also differentially private. If I take a differentially private algorithm and do some post-processing on it, I retain the property of differential privacy. So it has some nice computational properties which basically make it a good part of an overall system. Some challenges. What if records are correlated? So if, remember, that was a challenge that some of the other schemes faced. Here also, differential privacy takes a hit. It's if, for example, there are members in my data set who are related somehow, like maybe you and I go out together on a hike, and therefore every day of the week, and therefore the number of steps we take are highly correlated, then if I am revealed then something about you will be revealed. So that becomes a dicey issue, but can be handled in this theoretical framework still. There are also other things that I might want, where there might be other connections, like social networks and all, which again kind of goes to the correlation. I might want privacy in a group setting. So there are additional issues that kind of come up out here, which one has to consider. So now another thing, if you notice, is that in this case it's kind of a probabilistic flavor. We are looking at algorithms which are giving output at a certain probability. So one question which comes up is, can I do these things for deterministic algorithms? Like number of steps or these kind of things that we kind of often talk about. So turns out, unfortunately, for non-deterministic algorithms, it's a harder problem to solve. So just something to keep in mind. I think I'm running short of time, so I'm going to jump through things. Okay, so it turns out that there is a result in differential privacy literature which shows that for a large class of functions, the optimal type of noise to add is a Laplacian noise. Okay, so essentially noise which follows a Laplacian distribution. And so a lot of algorithms which are algorithms over the set. So essentially these are algorithms which are one way of thinking about places where it works is where your query is over a set of values. So if I were to shuffle the values, the query would remain, answer to the query will remain unchanged. And in those kind of settings, it turns out that the optimal way of achieving, or whatever, good way of achieving differential privacy is that you take your query over the original data set and then you add a Laplacian noise with a certain mean to it, where the mean does depend upon some knowledge about the data set that you would have. Another issue which comes up, and this is the following: every time you answer a query, you are leaking a little bit of information about the data set, okay? Because the whole framework is kind of has this probabilistic flavor. So the way differential privacy works is, every time you answer a query, you keep track of how much the adversary now knows about the data set, and after some time, you stop answering the queries. Okay, so that's a very critical part of this framework, that there is a query budget. There's a privacy budget. So every time you answer a query, your privacy budget goes down, and when it hits 0, you stop answering the query. So that's another element out here. So how much noise you add really depends upon how sensitive the answer output is to the value of your records. So my billionaire example was deliberately designed to trigger that, because essentially over the population, in the worst case, the sensitivity was pretty high, and therefore one has to take into account. So essentially it says the mean of the Laplacian noise that I have to add is sensitivity divided by epsilon. So if I'm very sensitive, I have to add a lot of noise. Okay, that's unfortunately I'm hand waving a lot, but this is also a pretty deep topic. There are like entire books on differential privacy, so I can barely scratch the surface out here. But it works great on a lot of things like counting things, training a machine learning model, stuff like that, stuff which works over the whole data set. It gives a very formal guarantee, quantifiable thing, all these things like privacy budget and all that, all been worked out. So theoretically rooted very nicely. Okay, let's see. Okay, so this Laplace noise is designed for any query where the output is a real number, okay, or integer, okay. So I can basically kind of talk about errors in terms of true answer minus noisy answer and all. But oftentimes we want to do things which are not real numbers. Oftentimes what we want to do is answer queries like what was the most common category type of some sort, right? I mean, so in this case, the answer being the query that we are asking is of this nature. So in this particular case, it turns out that a different type of noise structure works better, is optimal, and that's an exponential mechanism that they add. I'm going to again kind of skip over this part, but just wanted to mention that for these kind of responses, there is a different structure that applies. Okay, let's see, what else do I want to say? Yeah, so I guess the final one is that one of the things which have emerged in recent times is this whole notion of differentially private machine learning. And kind of the idea out here is that now you're training algorithms. So I'm sure many of you have probably taken some machine learning class or the other. So you'll learn about how you do backprop, you compute the gradients and stuff like that to kind of end up with the estimate for the parameter values. And kind of the idea is that I have training data. I want you to learn the model, but I don't want your model to have information about the original data. So the idea then becomes that during training time, you perturb the gradient information, and you do that perturbation again driven by this differentially private consideration. So essentially, you can say that model training algorithms are complex queries over a database, and therefore in the learning step we introduce, just like we introduce Laplacian noise, we kind of introduce noise whenever you are computing some stuff over that. So there are all sort of things like differentially private k-means, differentially private linear regression, differentially private neural networking, and all, and there is kind of some nice Python libraries and all. So if you want to do privacy aware machine learning, then there are packages available and all which now can help you in this regard. There are other ideas. I know again one group is pursuing a project on kind of privacy meets machine learning, but it's kind of a important topic which currently exists. So that's what we have. I think kind of 3 minutes remaining. But the person who invented differential privacy is, like I said, was a researcher at Microsoft, Cynthia Dork. She's a professor at Harvard, so she has a nice book. If you Google, there are some, in the last few years, like last 4 or 5 years, there have been tutorials on this topic at every major conference. The setting where differential privacy doesn't work, and what I mean by doesn't work is that you can't find a differentially private algorithm easily. So one setting is where I'm an individual, I'm subscribed to a service, the service knows who you are, so the question is not of me hiding, but it's my behaviors, okay? So one has to be very careful, what do we mean by differentially private there? Then highly correlated data, again, hard to find. As a model, yeah, it certainly applies, because all the model says is that I should not be able to infer. So let's imagine the following. So let's say collecting my sensor data and I'm publishing it, and you are going to be, some adversary is going to be querying it. So what is a reasonable definition of differentially private there? So for example, it could be, let's say I wish to hide whether I ate Chinese food or not, okay? So the neighboring time series, there would be one where I ate Chinese food versus I didn't eat Chinese food. And therefore, your queries over that should be one where the ambiguity remains. So again, if the question you were to ask was, did Mani eat Chinese food on Thursday, for example, that would be very hard to make differentially private. On the other hand, if you're trying to learn a model to predict whether, given a day-long segment of my time series, whether I ate Chinese food that day or not, you could perhaps create a differentially private machine learning model for it. So one has to frame the problem right in order for a differentially private algorithm to exist, but the basic definition applies. And the beauty out here is that throughout we made no assumption about what the adversary knows. Okay, so it's independent of side channel and stuff like that. So unlike other methods previously where other databases and all made a difference, here it makes no difference. So anyway, so it's, the entire courses and I had books and all on it, so I covered it in like less than a lecture, but it's a pretty nice piece of work in recently. So okay, so I'm going to stop here. So on Thursday again we have a round of paper presentations. So as usual, send it. You know the protocol. I've already added it on Ritscope. Yeah.